6 months after my grandfather died, I flew home to a total shock. 22 buildings stood where his empty field used to be. Neighbors gasped. Nobody would look me in the eye. The HOA president smiled at me like she owned the world. I stayed calm. Question: where's the deed? Her smile flickered. Just enough. Somewhere in a drawer, an old envelope was about to change everything. She had no idea what she'd just built. For me. My name is Maya Thornton, 34, a structural engineer who spent the last 3 years on an overseas bridge contract in Rotterdam. My grandfather, Walter, raised me after my parents passed, and the 12 acres behind Cedar Hollow Estates was the only home I'd ever truly known. When Walter died in the spring, I was mid-project and couldn't come home for the funeral. My cousin handled the service. I told myself I'd deal with the land later. A quiet field of oak trees and one crooked mailbox was never going anywhere. I was wrong. Cedar Hollow Estates sat behind a gated entrance in a mid-sized Ohio suburb. The kind of place with manicured lawns, mandatory beige shutters, and a Facebook group that argued about trash cans more than local elections. Deborah Ashcroft had run the HOA board for 11 straight years. Deborah wasn't just president. She was the HOA watch. Every fence height, every mailbox style. People called her thorough. Others called her something less polite behind closed doors. Either way, nobody crossed Deborah Ashcroft and came out unscathed. My grandfather's field bordered the neighborhood's back fence line. 12 acres of undeveloped land he'd bought decades before Cedar Hollow existed. The HOA's original plat maps listed it as adjacent undeveloped parcel. Ownership unconfirmed. That single vague phrase would later become the whole story. For years, Deborah eyed that field like a woman staring at a slice of cake she wasn't allowed to eat. She proposed a community garden. Then a dog park. Actually, something bigger. A mixed-use commercial plaza. With shops, a spa, and rental units. For the benefit of every resident. Walter refused every single request. Politely, but firmly. He told me once, over coffee, "Maya, that woman wants my dirt real bad. Someday she'll try something. When she does, remember the filing cabinet in my study." I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. After Walter's funeral, the HOA sent me a form letter of condolence, followed 2 weeks later by a friendly notice that the parcel behind the neighborhood was, per their records, unclaimed and would be absorbed into a community improvement initiative unless a valid owner objected within 30 days. I was still overseas, buried in blueprints, jet-lagged and grieving. The notice went to Walter's old address, which forwarded slowly through an overwhelmed postal system. By the time it reached me digitally through my cousin, 22 days had already burned off that 30-day window. My cousin, Renee, texted me photos of survey stakes going up in the field. I called the HOA office. A cheerful assistant told me the parcel had been legally cleared for development per historical records on file, and any concerns should be addressed to the board president, Deborah Ashcroft. I called Deborah directly, almost maternal, explaining that the HOA had tried for years to locate an owner and finally, with county guidance, classified it as abandoned acreage. "It's practically a gift to the community. Honey," she said.
"You should be proud your family's land will find."
I told her I was the owner. She laughed, not unkindly, just dismissively, and said the county records showed no clear title holder, only an estate in probate limbo. She suggested I get my paperwork sorted before making accusations. Then she hung up, sweetly, like she'd won something. I flew home 2 weeks later, jet-lagged and furious, expecting to find survey stakes and maybe a cleared lot. Instead, I found bulldozers, poured foundations, and steel framing rising against the sky. 22 structures in various stages of construction, all planted firmly on my grandfather's 12 acres. Renee met me at the gate, pale and apologetic. They started fast. Maya. Like, suspiciously fast. Deborah kept saying the county expedited the permits because it was community infrastructure. Nobody on the board questioned her. You know how she gets when people question her. I walked the site in stunned silence. A half-built spa. Row. Concrete trucks idling near where Walter's old oak tree used to stand. Now a stump. My chest tightened with something between grief and rage. This wasn't land anymore. This was theft wearing a hard hat. A construction foreman noticed me staring and asked if I needed help. I told him I was the landowner. He blinked, radioed someone, and within 10 minutes, Deborah Ashcroft herself appeared in a visor and a clipboard, walking toward me like she was greeting a lost tourist, not a trespasser's victim. Maya, she said, beaming. I was so sorry about Walter. Come. Let me show you what we're building. It's going to change Cedar Hollow forever. She gestured at the skeleton buildings like a realtor selling a dream. She hadn't even paused to consider I might object. Deborah, this is my land, I said flatly. She tilted her head, amused, like a teacher humoring a confused student. Sweetheart, the county cleared this parcel for HOA development months ago. I have the paperwork. Probate takes forever. I'm sure this will all get sorted once your grandfather's estate settles. I asked to see the paperwork. She said it was at the office, always at the office, always somewhere else, always tomorrow. I'd built enough infrastructure projects to recognize a runaround when I heard one. Someone had moved fast and loose, and Deborah intended to keep it that way. That night, I called a real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Priya Nair who'd helped Walter once with a boundary dispute years earlier. She remembered him fondly. When I described the situation, she went quiet, then said, Maya, don't say another word to that HOA until I see the deed. The next morning, I drove to Walter's house, my house now, and found the filing cabinet in his study, exactly where he'd told me. Inside, alphabetized with obsessive precision, sat every document of his life, tax records, medical files, and a thick folder labeled simply, the field. Inside that folder was the original deed, notarized in 1987, plus something even more interesting, a 2015 amendment adding a survivorship clause naming me sole heir to the parcel, recorded at the county clerk's office. Walter hadn't just protected the land. He'd fortified it years in advance. I photographed every page and sent them straight to Priya. She called back within the hour, voice sharp with focus. This deed is airtight, Maya. If the HOA built anything on this land without your consent, we're not talking about a dispute. We're talking about trespass and unjust enrichment. Armed with copies, I returned to the HOA office, calm and prepared. Deborah's assistant, a nervous young man named Corey, tried to stall me at the front desk. I placed the deed on the counter and asked him to make Deborah aware that the landowner was here, in person, with proof. Deborah emerged from her office 10 minutes later. All smiles evaporated. She scanned the deed, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "This is," said. "I'll need our attorney to verify authenticity. These things get complicated in probate. I wouldn't want you to get your hopes up prematurely." "There's no probate dispute," I said. "The survivorship clause transferred ownership automatically at his death. This land has been mine since the day he died. Every structure your crews poured concrete for is sitting on private property without permission." Deborah's smile returned, thinner now, more calculated than warm. "Well," she said, "mistakes happen. But the community has invested heavily already. Perhaps we can discuss a reasonable arrangement. A lease, something generous. Nobody wants lawyers involved in a friendly neighborhood matter." Her voice softened, but her eyes had gone cold and calculating. I told her I'd think about it, mostly to buy time to understand the full scope of what she'd done. Walking to my car, I noticed something odd. A construction sign near the entrance read, "Cedar Hollow Commercial Plaza, a Deborah Ashcroft Legacy Project." Her name, not the HOA's. That detail nagged at me all night. HOA projects were supposed to be community-funded and community-owned, not personal legacy branding. I mentioned it to Priya, who immediately requested HOA financial records through a formal demand letter. Curious why Deborah's name was attached so prominently to a supposedly communal effort. 2 days later, the HOA's board treasurer, a soft-spoken retiree named Harold Wick, quietly reached out to me. He asked to meet somewhere off the neighborhood grounds, a diner 3 towns over, and told me he had some concerns about how the whole project had actually been funded. Over lukewarm coffee, Harold explained that Deborah had pushed the commercial plaza through an emergency board vote with almost no public notice, citing time-sensitive county incentives. Reserve funds meant for community pool repairs had been quietly redirected. He'd voted yes, he admitted, because he was afraid of her temper. "She's not someone you disagree with," Harold said, hands shaking slightly around his mug. "Last year she got a woman's dog impounded over a leash violation just to make a point. I didn't want to be next. But this feels different. This feels like actual fraud." "Maya." Harold slid a folder across the table. Partial financial statements he'd copied before Deborah restricted board access to the accounting software. Numbers didn't add up. Construction costs exceeded reserve fund limits by nearly triple, with no corresponding special assessment ever approved by homeowner vote, as HOA bylaws required. I asked Harold why he hadn't gone to the county or the state HOA regulatory board already. He looked down, embarrassed. "Because I'm scared of her, and because part of me hoped it would just work out. I'm telling you because you're the only person with enough proof to actually stop her." Back home, I dug through Walter's files again and found something else. Correspondence from years earlier, Deborah requesting to buy the field outright, offering a lowball price Walter flatly refused. Attached was a handwritten note in his script. "She'll try again after I'm gone. Don't let her win. Maya." It hit me then that this wasn't recent opportunism. Deborah had wanted this land for years, patiently waiting, watching for any crack in ownership to exploit. My grandfather's death wasn't just sad timing to her. It was the opening she'd been waiting for her entire HOA reign. I called a local news contact, a young reporter named Ben Alvarez who covered county development stories. He was intrigued but cautious, wanting documentation before running anything. I promised him copies once Priya finished compiling the paper trail. Small fires were starting. Deborah had no idea how many. Meanwhile, construction continued daily, unaware or unbothered by the storm brewing. 22 buildings kept climbing skyward on land that legally belonged to me. Every nail driven, every beam raised, was quietly, invisibly, becoming an asset I hadn't asked for but was absolutely entitled to under long-standing property law. Priya explained a legal principle that made my stomach flip with adrenaline. Fixtures built on someone else's land, without a valid lease or license, generally become the property of the landowner. Deborah wasn't just trespassing. She was, unknowingly, constructing an entire commercial plaza that would legally belong to me. She has options, Priya cautioned. She could argue innocent improver status and demand compensation for materials. But given the forged notice, the improper board vote, and misused reserve funds, a judge is unlikely to feel sympathetic toward someone acting in obvious bad faith. I felt something like hope for the first time. Still, I wasn't naive. Deborah had run this neighborhood for over a decade through charm, intimidation, and the quiet fear of dozens of homeowners. She wouldn't fold easily. If anything, cornering her would make her more dangerous, not less. I braced myself, gathering every document I could find. That weekend, an anonymous flyer appeared on neighborhood doors, warning residents that an outside party was trying to seize community property and halt improvements everyone supposedly wanted. No name was printed, but the tone was unmistakably Deborah's, sweet on the surface, venomous underneath. Within days, neighbors I'd known my whole life started avoiding eye contact at the mailbox. A woman named Tricia, who'd once brought Walter casseroles during chemo, crossed the street rather than say hello. Deborah's narrative had already reframed me. Not the rightful owner, but the villain threatening progress. I confronted Deborah at a public HOA meeting, standing quietly in the back until public comment. When I raised my hand, she visibly stiffened. I explained calmly that I owned the 12 acres, presented notarized deed copies, and asked the board to halt construction immediately pending legal resolution. Deborah interrupted before I finished. Voice syrupy sweet for the crowd. We understand grief affects judgment. Miss Thornton is welcome to pursue any claims through proper legal channels. But we won't let one grieving individual derail a project benefiting 300 families. Applause followed. After the meeting, Corey, the nervous assistant, caught up with me in the parking lot, glancing over his shoulder nervously. She told the surveyor to backdate the site assessment, he whispered. I saw the email. But I can't stay quiet either. I'll help you. Corey forwarded me screenshots from his work email later that night, showing Deborah instructing the county surveyor's office to adjust the parcel classification timeline to make it appear the land had been formally reviewed and cleared months before construction actually began. It was documentary proof of deliberate fraud. Priya filed an emergency injunction request the next morning, citing clear title ownership, unauthorized construction, and evidence of falsified county records. A judge granted a temporary halt to construction pending a hearing. A legal gut punch Deborah would learn about live. On site, in front of her entire crew. The sheriff's office delivered the injunction paperwork directly to the construction site. I wasn't there, but Harold texted me a photo. Deborah standing frozen, clipboard in hand, foreman staring at the paper like it might bite him. For the first time, her carefully built empire had actually stopped moving. Deborah called me that evening, voice tight, stripped of its usual saccharine warmth. "You're making a massive mistake," she said. "This community needs this project. People's home values depend on it. You'll be the most hated woman in Cedar Hollow if you keep this up." I hung up without responding. The next HOA newsletter arrived with a subtly rewritten history. The commercial plaza was now temporarily delayed due to a boundary dispute, framing me as an obstacle rather than a victim. Deborah's PR instincts were sharp. She understood optics better than she understood property law. And that made her dangerous. Then, the reporter published a small piece questioning the HOA's construction timeline after obtaining Corey's leaked emails through me. It wasn't front-page news yet, but it planted a public question mark over Deborah's flawless image for the very first time in 11 years of unchecked leadership. Deborah retaliated fast. She filed a formal HOA complaint against me for unauthorized structures. My grandfather's decades-old tool shed, sitting well within my property line, suddenly cited for code violations dating back years. It was petty, obvious retaliation, but it forced me to spend money defending irrelevant paperwork. My attorney recognized the tactic immediately. "Delay and drain," Priya called it. "She can't beat you on the merits, so she's trying to bleed your resources and patience instead." I dismissed the shed complaint through a simple grandfather clause defense. But the message was clear. Deborah intended to fight dirty. A neighbor named George, quiet and elderly, approached me at the mailbox one afternoon. "She did this to me too," he murmured, glancing around nervously. "Forced me to repave my driveway over a technicality that didn't exist. I paid $4,000 I didn't have. Nobody stops her because everyone's scared." George's story matched a pattern I was starting to see clearly. Selective enforcement, manufactured violations, and quiet financial punishment for anyone who questioned Deborah's authority. This wasn't just one bad decision about a field. This was a system of control she'd built patiently, year after year, unchallenged. I started collecting statements quietly, carefully, through Priya's office to keep them protected and organized. George. 2 other families who'd been fined for minor infractions right after voicing HOA criticism online. A pattern of abuse was forming, one Deborah clearly believed no one would ever compile. Meanwhile, construction crews sat idle, costing the HOA money daily in equipment rental and labor standby fees. Deborah, desperate to keep momentum, dipped further into reserve funds without board approval. According to Harold, who now secretly forwarded me redacted financial summaries every few days from home, the temporary injunction hearing arrived. Deborah showed up with a slick attorney in an expensive suit, clearly retained using HOA funds without membership approval. Priya, calm and precise, laid out the timeline, deed, survivorship clause, falsified survey dates, and unauthorized reserve fund spending. The judge's expression grew increasingly skeptical. Deborah's attorney argued good faith improvement, claiming the HOA believed the land was legitimately unclaimed. The judge asked, pointedly, why county correspondence showed the survey date had been manually altered after construction began. Deborah's attorney had no good answer. Deborah's practiced calm cracked, just slightly, for the courtroom to see. The judge extended the injunction indefinitely pending a full civil trial, effectively freezing the 22 half-built structures in place. Outside the courthouse, Deborah cornered me, whispering through gritted teeth, "You have no idea what you've started." I looked her dead in the eye. "Neither do you," I said. That night, someone slashed 2 tires on my car, parked outside Walter's house. No note, no witnesses, nothing provable. But the timing wasn't subtle. I filed a police report anyway, more for the paper trail than any real hope of an arrest. Deborah's fingerprints were everywhere except literally on the knife. Renee suggested I install security cameras. I did, quietly, covering the driveway, the field's access road, and the old barn where Walter used to keep tools. Within a week, footage captured a familiar white SUV slowing near the property line late at night before speeding off without stopping. The SUV's plate matched Deborah's registration, easily confirmed through public county records. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I gave the footage to Priya, who filed it alongside the growing civil case as evidence of intimidation. Deborah was making mistakes now, small cracks appearing in her once flawless armor. The HOA board, sensing the mounting pressure, called an emergency closed meeting. Harold texted me updates in real time from the parking lot, unable to attend openly without raising suspicion. 2 board members, previously silent, were reportedly now questioning Deborah's unilateral spending decisions for the very first time. Deborah reportedly threatened to resign dramatically if the board didn't back her completely, banking on their fear of managing the crisis without her. It almost worked, until Harold quietly produced the redacted financial documents showing the improper reserve fund transfers, stunning the room into uncomfortable silence. One board member, a soft-spoken teacher named Alicia, asked the question nobody had dared voice aloud. "Deborah, did you know this land had a clear owner before construction began?" Deborah's answer was a long pause, followed by a deflection about acting in good faith for the community's benefit. Word of the tense meeting spread through the neighborhood group chat within hours, filtered and distorted through rumor. Some residents defended Deborah loyally, insisting I was some outsider trying to cash in. Others, emboldened by Harold and George's quiet testimonies, began openly questioning her leadership for the first time. Ben's follow-up article expanded the story significantly, now including confirmed reserve fund misuse and the falsified survey date evidence. Local television picked it up as a minor human interest segment. Grieving granddaughter fights HOA over inherited land. Suddenly, my quiet family land dispute had a public spotlight shining on it. Deborah's response was a carefully worded press statement, insisting the HOA acted transparently within legal guidance, and that a misunderstanding regarding parcel ownership was being resolved amicably. It was a masterclass in spin, technically true in phrasing while completely misrepresenting the actual, documented sequence of events. Despite the public pressure building steadily, construction remained frozen, and the HOA's legal bills climbed fast. Homeowner assessments began quietly increasing to cover mounting attorney fees, a fact Deborah conveniently left out of her cheerful monthly newsletters that still praised the temporarily paused community improvement project. I met with Priya to plan our next legal move, a a formal civil suit demanding either full compensation for unauthorized use of my land,
or clear legal recognition that the 22 structures, as improvements built without valid permission, now belong to me under long-standing fixture and property law.
For a brief stretch, things went eerily quiet. Construction sat frozen. Deborah stopped attending public events. Even the anonymous flyers stopped appearing on doors. Renee joked that maybe Deborah had finally realized she couldn't win. I didn't believe it for a second. Quiet, with someone like her, was never. I used the lull to visit Walter's grave for the first time since returning home, finally letting myself grieve properly instead of fighting fires constantly. Sitting there, I told him quietly that his filing cabinet had saved everything he'd built. I could almost hear him laughing at Deborah's audacity. Harold reached out less frequently during this period, mentioning that Deborah had grown noticeably paranoid, questioning which board members might be leaking information to me. Corey, worried about his job, asked to pause direct communication for a while. I understood completely and thanked him for everything he'd already risked. George invited me over for coffee, sharing more stories about Deborah's decade of quiet intimidation across the neighborhood. Small fines, a community garden proposal killed simply because it wasn't her idea. The picture forming wasn't just about my field anymore. It was about accountability finally arriving. I used the calm window to organize every piece of evidence chronologically with Priya's paralegal. The deed, the survivorship clause, falsified survey timestamps, financial misappropriation records, intimidation footage, and now sworn witness statements from Harold and George. The case against Deborah was becoming remarkably, almost overwhelmingly, thorough. Ben published a longer investigative piece during the lull, digging into HOA reserve fund history over the past 5 years. Numbers didn't fully add up even before the Commercial Plaza project began. Smaller discrepancies, easily hidden individually, suddenly looked suspicious stacked together across multiple budget cycles. A county auditor's office, alerted by Ben's reporting, quietly opened a preliminary review into Cedar Hollow HOA's financial practices. Deborah wasn't informed immediately, but Harold learned through a board colleague with county connections. The walls, slowly and quietly, were beginning to close in around her. I received an unexpected email from a woman named Lisa Contreras, a former HOA board treasurer who'd resigned abruptly 3 years earlier. She wanted to talk outside the neighborhood, and she brought a laptop full of old financial records she'd secretly kept. Lisa explained she'd resigned after discovering Deborah routing consulting fees to a company that, upon closer inspection, was owned by Deborah's brother-in-law. She'd been too afraid to go public back then, fearing retaliation and reputation damage. Now, watching my story unfold publicly, she finally felt safe enough to speak. This was twist number 1 confirmed on paper. Deborah's decade of unchecked power hadn't started with my field. It had been building slowly through small, deniable financial schemes for years, each one slightly bigger than the last, until she felt untouchable enough to attempt something as brazen as this. Priya added Lisa's records to the growing case file, strengthening the pattern of fraud argument significantly. A single incident could be explained away as a mistake. A decade-long pattern, corroborated by multiple credible witnesses and documents, painted an unmistakable picture of deliberate, calculated financial abuse of power. The quiet period ended abruptly when Deborah, apparently sensing the tightening net, made a desperate move. She called an emergency homeowner vote, proposing to formally transfer disputed HOA improved land into community trust ownership, attempting to legally bury my claim under a manufactured democratic mandate before trial. I found out about the emergency vote only 2 days beforehand, through Alicia, the increasingly uneasy board teacher. Deborah had scheduled it deliberately during a weekday afternoon, hoping low attendance and confused wording would push it through quietly before anyone fully understood what was actually being voted on. Priya moved immediately, filing an emergency motion arguing the proposed vote was both legally meaningless, since the land ownership issue was already under active civil litigation, and procedurally improper under Ohio HOA governance statutes requiring proper notice periods for major asset decisions affecting homeowner assessments. The judge agreed swiftly, issuing a restraining order blocking the vote entirely until the underlying property case resolved. Deborah, humiliated publicly for the second time in court, reportedly stormed out of the courthouse without speaking to reporters, a stark contrast to her usual polished public composure. Ben's coverage intensified. Now framing the story statewide, HOA president tries emergency vote to seize disputed property amid fraud investigation. Comments flooded in from other HOA communities describing eerily similar patterns of unchecked president authority, selective enforcement, and quiet reserve fund manipulation across different neighborhoods entirely. Deborah's inner circle began fracturing visibly. 2 longtime board loyalists resigned within the same week, citing personal reasons, publicly while privately telling Harold they no longer wanted their names attached to what was clearly becoming a full-blown legal and financial scandal with real consequences approaching fast. A furious Deborah reportedly confronted Harold directly, accusing him of leaking documents. Harold, emboldened by the mounting evidence and growing public support, finally stood his ground for the first time in years. "I voted your way out of fear," he told her. "That fear is gone now." Deborah, word of that confrontation spread through the neighborhood almost instantly, becoming a strange turning point in public opinion. Residents who'd defended Deborah out of habit began quietly reconsidering. If even her most loyal board ally was distancing himself, maybe the outsider's story wasn't so outlandish after all. Tricia, the neighbor who'd crossed the street to avoid me earlier, showed up unannounced at Walter's door with a homemade pie and an awkward apology. "I didn't know the full story," she admitted. "Deborah made it sound like you were just trying to grab free money off dead HOA land. I invited Tricia in, and over pie, explained everything calmly. The deed, the survivorship clause, the falsified survey, the reserve fund misuse." She listened, visibly shaken, admitting she'd also been quietly fined last year over an unapproved flower bed shortly after questioning an HOA decision publicly online. More neighbors began reaching out similarly, sharing their own quiet stories of selective enforcement and unexplained fines. A pattern of fear-based control was surfacing publicly for the first time in Cedar Hollow's 11-year history under Deborah's leadership, each individual story adding weight to an increasingly undeniable collective truth. Deborah, sensing her grip loosening, doubled down rather than retreating. She hired a crisis PR consultant using undisclosed HOA funds, launching a slick social media campaign painting herself as a tireless community servant under attack from outside interests. It was polished, expensive, and increasingly disconnected from reality. The PR campaign backfired almost immediately when Ben discovered and reported the consultant's fees, paid directly from HOA reserves without any board vote or homeowner disclosure whatsoever. What was meant to rehabilitate Deborah's image instead became fresh evidence of exactly the unchecked spending pattern under active investigation. The county auditor's preliminary review, previously quiet, expanded into a formal financial audit request following Ben's reporting and the auditor's own findings of irregularities. Deborah was formally notified this time, required to produce 5 years of complete financial records within 30 days or face escalating penalties. Priya used the formal audit announcement strategically, filing it as supporting evidence in our civil case, arguing Deborah's pattern of financial secrecy directly supported. The claim that the commercial plaza construction had been rushed through improperly, without legitimate oversight, specifically to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. Corey resurfaced quietly, no longer working for the HOA after Deborah, paranoid, had fired him over unrelated pretenses weeks earlier. Free from employment fear, he agreed to testify formally about the falsified survey timeline emails, strengthening our documented evidence considerably with first-hand account of the actual instructions given. Lisa Contreras also agreed to testify formally about the older consulting fee scheme benefiting Deborah's brother-in-law, providing crucial historical context showing this wasn't an isolated incident but rather the escalation of a long-running pattern of quiet financial abuse stretching back years before my grandfather's death even occurred. George and Tricia both agreed to submit sworn statements about selective code enforcement and retaliatory fines following any public criticism of Deborah's leadership. Alicia, still on the board, quietly provided internal meeting notes confirming Deborah had known about my ownership claim well before construction crews ever broke ground. Priya compiled everything into a comprehensive amended complaint. Fraud, unjust enrichment, trespass, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional intimidation, now supported by 6 credible witnesses, financial documents spanning years, falsified timestamps, and video evidence. Deborah's carefully constructed empire was collapsing under the weight of documented, undeniable truth. The civil trial date was set, moved up faster than expected due to the county's parallel financial investigation creating urgency around the case. Deborah's attorney requested a delay, citing the need for additional preparation time. The judge denied it, noting the extensive discovery period already granted previously. Deborah, cornered legally and financially, made one final desperate attempt at damage control. She reached out to me directly, requesting a private meeting as one neighbor to another, proposing an out-of-court settlement that would let her save face publicly while quietly conceding just enough ground to avoid full exposure. I agreed to the meeting, mostly out of curiosity about what she'd offer, with Priya's blessing and a recording device running with full legal consent under Ohio's one-party consent law. Deborah arrived at the coffee shop looking noticeably older than before, the polished veneer finally showing real cracks underneath. "I'll transfer the land back." Quietly, she offered. "No lawsuit, no public trial, no more headlines for either of us. You keep the land, I keep my reputation. Everyone wins." I asked about the 22 buildings already constructed on that land. Her carefully rehearsed calm faltered slightly, visibly. "We can discuss compensation for materials," she said quickly. "Reasonable compensation. Obviously." I asked about the falsified survey dates, the misused reserve funds, and the retaliatory fines against George, Tricia, and others. Deborah's expression hardened. "Those are separate matters," she snapped. unrelated to our land discussion entirely. I told her calmly that nothing was separate anymore, that every piece connected into one clear, documented pattern of abuse spanning years, and that I had no intention of quietly settling something this serious just to protect her reputation. Her mask finally slipped completely, revealing genuine, unfiltered fury underneath. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she hissed. Voice suddenly cold and sharp, stripped entirely of its usual honeyed sweetness. "I built this community. I decide what happens here. Not some overseas engineer who barely visited her own grandfather while he was dying." That comment cut deep. I held my composure, though her words stung more than I let show. "Walter knew exactly what you were," I replied evenly. "He left instructions specifically anticipating this moment. You didn't outsmart a grieving granddaughter, Deborah. You walked directly into a trap an old man built years before you even tried." Her face went white for just a moment before hardening back into practiced composure. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair slightly, and left without another word. The recording, later reviewed by Priya, captured everything clearly: the threat, the admission of knowledge, and the complete breakdown of her civil facade. 2 days later, the county audit findings leaked partially to Ben through an anonymous county employee source, revealing nearly $200,000 in questionable HOA expenditures over 5 years, including the consulting fees to Deborah's brother-in-law and unauthorized crisis PR spending during the current scandal. The story exploded regionally. Local news vans appeared outside Cedar Hollow's gated entrance. Homeowners, previously silent out of fear, began speaking openly to reporters about years of selective enforcement and unexplained fines. Deborah's carefully maintained image, built over 11 patient years, was disintegrating rapidly in real time. Deborah attempted one last public counterattack, calling an emergency homeowner meeting to address false accusations directly. Attendance was massive, curiosity and anger drawing nearly every household in Cedar Hollow. She stood before the packed room, visibly rattled but still attempting her signature blend of charm and authority. Before she could finish her prepared statement, Harold stood up publicly for the first time, reading aloud specific financial figures showing unauthorized reserve fund transfers directly tied to the Commercial Plaza project. Numbers that didn't match anything Deborah had ever reported in her cheerful monthly newsletters. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Deborah tried to interrupt, insisting Harold was misunderstanding complex accounting. But Alicia stood next, calmly confirming the board had never formally approved the reserve fund transfers Harold described, contradicting Deborah's claims of proper procedure directly in front of the entire community. George stood next, voice shaking but determined, describing his forced $4,000 driveway repaving under threat of escalating fines after questioning an HOA decision publicly years earlier. Tricia followed, describing her own retaliatory flower bed fine. One by one, silenced residents finally found their collective voice that night. Deborah's composure cracked entirely under the mounting public testimony. She accused the room of turning into a mob, insisting everyone was twisting innocent decisions into conspiracy. But the room's mood had shifted decisively. Years of quiet fear were finally converting into open, collective anger directed squarely at her. Someone in the back shouted a question about the falsified survey timeline. Corey, present in the audience, stood and confirmed publicly, for the first time, that Deborah had personally instructed the timeline alteration via email, evidence he'd since provided formally to both Priya's legal team and county investigators. Deborah, cornered from every direction, resorted to her final tactic, personal attacks. She turned toward me directly, voice raised. This is about a woman who abandoned her dying grandfather for a career overseas, now trying to profit off guilt. The room went uncomfortably silent, waiting for my response. I stood calmly, addressing the room rather than just Deborah. My grandfather understood my work required travel. He supported it fully, stealing his land the moment he could no longer defend it himself. That's not guilt talking. That's simply the documented truth. Applause, hesitant at first, spread through the room. Even longtime Deborah loyalists remained silent, unwilling to publicly defend her anymore given everything laid bare that evening. The meeting ended in chaos, with Deborah storming out, flanked by her attorney, cameras flashing outside as she pushed through the crowd. The following week, 3 additional board members resigned simultaneously, releasing a joint statement expressing profound concerns regarding financial transparency and leadership conduct without directly naming Deborah, though everyone understood exactly who and what they meant by the carefully worded, obviously legally reviewed public statement. Deborah, increasingly isolated, made her most reckless move yet. Late one night, security footage captured her white SUV parked near the frozen construction site, followed by the sound of something being dragged across gravel. The next morning, critical site documentation stored in a temporary trailer had vanished entirely. Priya immediately filed an emergency motion regarding potential evidence tampering, submitting the timestamp security footage directly to both the civil court and the county investigators handling the financial audit. Destroying documents under active litigation wasn't just reckless anymore. It was a genuine criminal act with real consequences. The county sheriff's office opened a separate investigation into possible evidence tampering and obstruction, adding significant weight to the mounting legal pressure surrounding Deborah personally, beyond just the civil property dispute and financial audit already actively unfolding around her increasingly desperate and erratic behavior. Deborah's attorney, sensing the situation spiraling beyond simple civil litigation into genuine criminal exposure, reportedly urged her privately to settle immediately and cooperate fully with investigators. Sources close to the board said she refused, insisting she'd done nothing any reasonable community leader wouldn't have done. That refusal proved to be a critical, self-destructive turning point. Without cooperation, prosecutors began building a broader case, incorporating the falsified survey timeline, the reserve fund misappropriation, the consulting fee scheme benefiting her brother-in-law, and now the apparent evidence tampering caught clearly on camera that fateful night. Meanwhile, Ben published his most detailed investigative piece yet, laying out the entire 11-year timeline of Deborah's HOA leadership alongside every documented incident, selective enforcement, financial irregularities, the falsified survey, and now potential evidence tampering. The article went viral regionally, reaching statewide news outlets within days. A second twist emerged during this period. County records revealed Deborah's own son, operating under a slightly different business name, had been awarded the general contractor position for the Commercial Plaza project without any competitive bidding process. A clear conflict of interest nobody on the original board had questioned. This revelation transformed public perception entirely. It wasn't simply about a grieving woman's stolen inheritance anymore. It was about a leader who had systematically funneled community resources toward her own family for years, using fear, charm, and unchecked authority to prevent anyone from ever asking obvious, necessary questions. Deborah's son, contacted by Ben for comment, refused to answer directly, but issued a brief statement claiming his company had been the most qualified available contractor, conveniently omitting that no other contractors had ever actually been invited to bid on the multimillion-dollar commercial plaza project whatsoever. Priya amended the civil complaint once more, adding claims of self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty related to the contractor selection process, further strengthening an already overwhelming case against Deborah's decade of increasingly brazen, unchecked authority over Cedar Hollow's Homeowners Association and its considerable financial resources. The formal county audit findings were finally released publicly, confirming nearly $230,000 in questionable expenditures over 5 years, including consulting fees, unauthorized crisis PR spending, and construction cost overruns paid disproportionately to Deborah's son's contracting company without proper competitive bidding. Local prosecutors announced they were reviewing the audit findings for potential criminal charges, including embezzlement and fraud. Deborah, facing mounting civil, criminal, and reputational consequences simultaneously, retreated from public view entirely, no longer attending HOA events or responding to any media inquiries whatsoever. Her silence only fueled further speculation and anger. Neighbors who'd once feared her now openly discussed removal procedures outlined in the HOA bylaws, procedures nobody had ever previously needed since Deborah had maintained such tight, unquestioned control over Cedar Hollow's leadership for over a decade. A formal recall petition began circulating, gathering the required homeowner signatures within just 3 days, an unprecedented speed that reflected exactly how thoroughly public sentiment had shifted against Deborah's leadership following months of escalating revelations about fraud, self-dealing, intimidation, and increasingly reckless, desperate behavior. Deborah, desperate and cornered, made one final reckless gamble. She reportedly attempted to quietly transfer remaining HOA reserve funds into a separate account before the recall vote could formally remove her authority, a move Harold caught immediately and reported directly to both the board and county investigators. This attempted fund transfer became the final straw, providing prosecutors with clear, undeniable evidence of intent to conceal and misappropriate community funds actively under investigation. An emergency court order froze all HOA financial accounts, preventing any further movement of money while the criminal investigation proceeded forward. The recall vote proceeded as scheduled, overwhelming in its result. Deborah Ashcroft was formally removed from the Cedar Hollow HOA board, ending her 11-year reign in a single decisive evening. Homeowners finally exercising authority they'd possessed all along but had simply been too afraid to use. Alicia was appointed interim board president, immediately reversing several of Deborah's more punitive policies and launching a full internal review of every fine and code violation issued during her tenure. George and Tricia, among others, received formal apologies and reimbursement for their previously unjust penalties, with Deborah removed from any HOA authority. The civil trial proceeded on its original schedule, now with an even more overwhelming body of evidence: witness testimony, financial records, falsified documents, video footage, and the county's own formal audit findings, all pointing toward the exact same undeniable conclusion. Deborah, increasingly isolated and facing mounting legal bills of her own, finally accepted that a full trial would likely be devastating. Her attorney requested a private settlement conference, hoping to negotiate terms before a judge or jury heard the complete, damning scope of the evidence against her. Priya and I discussed our options carefully. A settlement could resolve things faster, but a public trial verdict would create a definitive, undeniable legal record, both for my own protection and as a warning to other HOA leaders who might consider similar abuses of unchecked community authority. We agreed to a settlement conference but refused to soften any core demands. Full legal recognition of my ownership over the land and all 22 structures built upon it.
Complete financial restitution for legal costs. And formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing regarding the falsified survey and fund misuse.
Deborah's attorney pushed back initially, proposing a partial settlement limiting compensation and avoiding formal admission of wrongdoing. Priya rejected it immediately, reminding them that the criminal investigation, entirely separate from our civil case, would proceed regardless of whatever civil settlement terms Deborah might eventually agree to accept. Faced with an unwinnable position, Deborah's attorney finally recommended full capitulation. The settlement terms were drafted. Complete legal transfer confirming my ownership of the land and all structures, full reimbursement of my legal fees, and a formal written admission that construction had proceeded without valid landowner consent. Deborah signed the settlement documents in a quiet, tense conference room, her hand visibly trembling slightly as she finalized what amounted to a complete legal and financial defeat. There was no dramatic speech, no final defiant outburst, just quiet, exhausted silence as 11 years of control finally ended. Outside the building afterward, reporters gathered for comment. Deborah's attorney issued a brief statement acknowledging the settlement without elaborating further. Deborah herself said nothing, walking quickly to her car, the same white SUV that security footage had once captured near the tampered evidence trailer months earlier. I stood on the courthouse steps afterward, Priya beside me, finally allowing myself a genuine smile for the first time in months. 22 commercial buildings, constructed without my knowledge or consent, now belonged entirely to me, along with formal legal vindication for everything Walter had quietly anticipated years before. Renee hugged me tightly outside, tears in her eyes. "Walter would be so proud of you," she said. I thought of his handwritten note in that filing cabinet folder. "Don't let her win. Maya." We hadn't just avoided losing. We turned Deborah's own greed into her complete, total downfall. The criminal investigation continued separately, prosecutors formally charging Deborah with embezzlement, fraud, evidence tampering, and falsifying government records within weeks of the civil settlement finalizing. Her son faced separate charges related to the improper contractor bidding scheme benefiting his company through his mother's authority. Ben's coverage of the criminal charges reached its widest audience yet, statewide outlets picking up the story as a cautionary tale about unchecked HOA leadership. Other communities began actively reviewing their own bylaws, inspired directly by Cedar Hollow's very public reckoning with years of quiet, unchecked authority. I received messages from strangers in other neighborhoods, thanking me for speaking up, describing eerily similar situations in their own communities involving overzealous board presidents nobody had previously dared to challenge. My private family land dispute had accidentally become something larger, a broader conversation about accountability. Meanwhile, I faced an unexpected practical question. What exactly does someone do with 22 half-built commercial structures suddenly, legally, entirely theirs? I wasn't interested in becoming a landlord or developer myself, but abandoning valuable, partially completed construction seemed equally wasteful given everything already invested into it. Priya connected me with a commercial real estate consultant experienced in exactly this kind of unusual situation. Together, we assessed the construction quality, remaining costs to completion, and realistic market value for the completed plaza, factoring in the area's genuine demand for additional retail and community space. The consultant's assessment was surprisingly optimistic. Despite the scandal surrounding its origin, the plaza's location and partial construction quality meant completing it properly could yield significant long-term rental income, effectively transforming Deborah's theft attempt into an unexpected, legitimate financial opportunity for Walter's family for generations. I decided to complete the project myself, properly this time, with legitimate permits, competitive contractor bidding, and full transparency throughout the entire process. It felt fitting somehow, finishing what Deborah had started illegally, but doing it honestly, turning her greed into something genuinely beneficial for the community. I hired a completely new construction team through a proper competitive bidding process, explicitly excluding Deborah's son's company from any consideration whatsoever. Within 4 months, the 22 structures were completed properly, inspected thoroughly, and ready for their intended commercial purposes across retail, wellness, and community services. The grand opening drew a surprisingly large crowd, curiosity mixing with genuine community interest in finally seeing what had caused so much dramatic upheaval over the past year. I stood at the ribbon cutting, thinking of Walter, wishing he could have seen his quiet field transform into something meaningful. Renee suggested naming the plaza after Walter, and I immediately agreed. Thornton Commons now stands where 22 illegally constructed buildings once represented Deborah's greed and arrogance, transformed instead into a legitimate, thriving community space bearing my grandfather's name and quiet, patient wisdom that ultimately protected everything. Harold, George, Tricia, and several other affected homeowners attended the opening, each receiving small discounts on retail leases as a quiet thank you for their courage in speaking up when it mattered most. It felt important to acknowledge that Deborah's downfall required many brave voices, not just mine alone. Alicia, now permanently elected as HOA president following Deborah's removal, spoke briefly at the opening, promising renewed transparency and accountability moving forward. The HOA's bylaws were formally revised within months, adding strict financial oversight requirements and term limits specifically designed to prevent future unchecked authority accumulation. Corey, who'd risked his job leaking crucial evidence, was offered a management position at Thornton Commons, a small gesture acknowledging his significant courage during the entire ordeal. He accepted gratefully, joking that it beat working for someone who once threatened to backdate his own performance reviews too. Lisa Contreras, whose historical evidence proved crucial in establishing Deborah's long-running pattern of financial abuse, received a formal community recognition award during the opening ceremony, acknowledging her bravery in coming forward years after her initial resignation, when speaking up had seemed far too risky. Deborah's criminal trial began roughly 8 months after the civil settlement concluded, prosecutors presenting an overwhelming case built from years of documented fraud, falsified records, evidence tampering, and clear self-dealing benefiting her own family through unchecked HOA authority spanning more than a decade of quiet abuse. I attended the trial's opening statements, watching Deborah sit rigidly at the defense table, stripped entirely of her once commanding presence. Gone was the confident HOA president who'd once smiled dismissively at my ownership claims. In her place sat someone visibly exhausted, isolated, and facing genuine consequences finally. The prosecution called Harold first, whose calm, detailed testimony about the unauthorized reserve fund transfers and emergency board vote manipulation set a devastating tone for the entire trial. Deborah's attorney's cross-examination barely dented his straightforward, well-documented account of exactly what had actually happened. Corey testified next, walking the jury through the falsified survey timeline emails in careful, methodical detail. His first-hand account of receiving direct instructions from Deborah to alter official documentation left little room for any alternative. Innocent interpretation of her clearly deliberate, calculated actions. Lisa Contreras' testimony about the older consulting fee scheme established the crucial pattern element prosecutors needed, showing this wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment but rather years of escalating financial abuse, each scheme slightly bolder than the last, culminating in the massive commercial plaza fraud. George and Tricia testified about years of selective code enforcement and retaliatory fines, painting a broader picture of intimidation and control that helped the jury understand exactly why so many homeowners had remained silent for so long despite clearly suspecting something was fundamentally wrong within their community. I testified as well, walking the jury through discovering the constructed buildings, Deborah's dismissive initial response, the falsified survey evidence, and her chilling threat during our recorded coffee shop meeting. The recording itself, played aloud in court, left a visibly stunned silence across the entire jury box. Deborah's own recorded voice, cold and threatening, filled the courtroom, admitting knowledge of my ownership claim before construction began, dismissing legitimate concerns, and threatening consequences for pursuing what was legally, unmistakably mine all along. Her attorney's objections couldn't erase what everyone had already clearly heard. The defense's strategy focused heavily on portraying Deborah as an overzealous but well-intentioned community leader who'd simply made poor judgment calls under pressure, never intending genuine harm. The overwhelming documented evidence, however, made that narrative increasingly difficult for the jury to accept as remotely plausible. Deborah's son testified reluctantly, attempting to defend the contractor selection process as legitimate and competitive. Under cross-examination, he admitted no other companies had ever actually been invited to submit competing bids, undermining his own testimony and further damaging his mother's already crumbling defense strategy significantly. The prosecution's financial expert walked the jury through the county audit findings methodically, detailing nearly $230,000 in questionable expenditures across 5 years, translating complex financial records into a clear, damning narrative even non-financial jury members could easily follow and understand. Deborah herself eventually took the stand in her own defense, attempting to explain her actions as good-faith community leadership decisions. Under cross-examination, prosecutors methodically dismantled her explanations, using her own recorded coffee shop admissions and the falsified survey evidence to expose clear, deliberate premeditation throughout. "Did you know Maya Thornton owned that land before construction began?" the prosecutor asked directly. Deborah hesitated, glancing toward her attorney, before finally admitting quietly that she'd had some awareness of a potential ownership question, but proceeded anyway, believing the community's needs outweighed individual property rights. That admission, delivered under oath, effectively confirmed every core element of the prosecution's case. Knowledge, intent, and deliberate disregard for clear legal ownership. Deborah's attorney's closing argument, though skillfully delivered, couldn't overcome the sheer weight of documented evidence and her own damning courtroom admission. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on all major charges, including embezzlement, fraud, falsifying government records, and evidence tampering. Deborah's face remained stoic as the verdict was read, though her hands trembled visibly against the defense table's polished wood surface. Sentencing was scheduled for several weeks later, allowing time for victim impact statements and formal sentencing recommendations from prosecutors. I decided to submit a written statement rather than speak publicly again, wanting to focus on Walter's legacy rather than dwelling further on Deborah's now confirmed criminal downfall. In my statement, I wrote about Walter's quiet foresight, his careful preparation years before Deborah ever attempted her scheme, and how his patient wisdom ultimately protected not just our family's land, but exposed years of hidden abuse affecting dozens of Cedar Hollow families who'd suffered silently for far too long. Harold, George, Tricia, and Lisa also submitted statements, each describing the genuine fear and financial harm Deborah's unchecked authority had caused throughout the years, painting a comprehensive picture for the judge of exactly how much damage one person's arrogance and greed could inflict on an entire community. The judge, reviewing all submitted statements alongside the formal sentencing recommendations, noted specifically the calculated, premeditated nature of Deborah's actions, the years-long pattern of abuse preceding the current case, and her continued lack of genuine remorse throughout the entire lengthy legal process. Deborah was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, along with mandatory full restitution covering the audit's identified financial discrepancies and my own legal costs beyond what the civil settlement had already covered. Her son received a suspended sentence and probation for his more limited role in the scheme. As Deborah was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, she glanced briefly toward the gallery where I sat with Renee, Harold, and George. There was no final defiant speech, no dramatic outburst, just a brief, exhausted look before she disappeared through the courtroom's side door, permanently, completely defeated. Outside the courthouse afterward, Ben approached for one final comment. I kept it simple. My grandfather taught me patience and preparation beat arrogance every single time. This was never really about buildings or land. It was about protecting what's right, even when someone powerful tells you that you can't. The story concluded its extensive media coverage with a final feature piece examining how one quiet, patient family's preparation had exposed over a decade of hidden HOA corruption, ultimately reforming not just Cedar Hollow's governance, but sparking broader statewide conversations about homeowners association accountability and oversight. Thornton Commons continued thriving in the following months, its retail spaces fully leased, its wellness spa becoming a genuine neighborhood gathering point. Walter's name, displayed prominently at the entrance, greeted visitors daily, quiet, permanent reminder of exactly how his patient foresight had protected everything that mattered. Alicia's reformed HOA board implemented sweeping transparency measures, public financial reporting, competitive bidding requirements for all contracts, term limits for board positions, and an independent audit review process designed specifically to prevent any future leader from accumulating the kind of unchecked authority Deborah once wielded. Harold, Corey, Lisa, George, and Tricia all remained close friends afterward, occasionally gathering at Thornton Commons for coffee, joking darkly about the year. Deborah nearly got away with stealing an entire commercial plaza before her own greed and arrogance ultimately became the very thing that destroyed her completely. Renee moved into Walter's old house permanently, helping manage Thornton Commons alongside me while I balanced occasional engineering contracts with my new, unexpected role as a local commercial property owner. Felt strange sometimes. This new life neither of us had ever anticipated inheriting so suddenly. Late one evening, sitting on Walter's porch overlooking the field that had caused so much upheaval, now transformed into a thriving, legitimate community plaza, I finally understood something clearly. Deborah's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating my legal claim. It was underestimating exactly how patient and prepared my grandfather truly was. Months later, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Priya's office. It was from Deborah, written from prison, requesting a meeting. Curious despite everything, I agreed, driving out to the correctional facility with Priya's cautious blessing. Uncertain exactly what closure, if any, this final conversation might actually provide. Deborah looked noticeably different across the visitation table. Hair grayer, posture smaller. The commanding presence she'd once projected effortlessly now completely gone. She stared at me quietly for a long moment before finally speaking, voice stripped of any remaining pretense or manipulation I'd grown so used to. "I convinced myself I was doing something good," she said quietly. "Building something for the community." Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing the difference between the community's good and my own ambition. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more genuine honesty than I'd ever heard from her. I told her calmly that Walter had actually predicted this exact confrontation years earlier, that he'd known someone eventually would try to take advantage once he was gone, and that his careful preparation, not luck, was ultimately what had protected everything she tried so desperately to seize for herself. Deborah asked, almost hesitantly, whether Thornton Commons was doing well. I told her yes. Thriving actually, employing local residents and generating exactly the kind of community benefit she'd originally, falsely, claimed to be pursuing. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Sitting there in that quiet visitation room. "I suppose that's some strange kind of justice," she said finally, almost smiling despite everything. The thing I stole ended up becoming exactly what I claimed I was building. Just without me. I didn't disagree. There was nothing left to argue about anymore. The truth had already settled everything completely. I left the prison that afternoon feeling an unexpected sense of closure rather than lingering anger. Deborah's downfall hadn't been about personal revenge for me. It had been about protecting Walter's legacy and exposing years of hidden harm affecting an entire community that had suffered silently for far too long. Driving home past Thornton Commons that evening, watching families shopping, neighbors chatting outside the wellness spa, children playing near the fountain we'd added during renovations, I finally felt Walter's quiet presence completely at peace. His patient preparation hadn't just protected our land. It had transformed an entire community. Harold called that night, checking in as he often did since everything settled. I told him about the prison visit, and he was quiet for a moment before saying, "You know, Maya, real strength isn't never getting knocked down. It's what you build afterward with everything you learned along the way." George and Tricia stopped by the following weekend, bringing Walter's old recipe for peach cobbler that Tricia had somehow acquired years earlier, insisting on recreating. it properly for a small gathering celebrating everything the community had overcome together throughout this long, difficult, ultimately transformative year of upheaval. Corey mentioned during the gathering that he'd started taking business courses at night, inspired partly by managing Thornton Commons successfully and partly by witnessing firsthand exactly how much genuine courage it took to stand up against unchecked authority when doing the right thing seemed dangerous and uncertain. Lisa brought her teenage daughter along, introducing her proudly as someone who'd learned an important lesson watching everything unfold. That speaking up, even years later, even when it felt too late, still mattered enormously and could still meaningfully contribute toward genuine accountability and lasting positive change. Alicia stopped by briefly too, sharing updates about the HOA's continued reforms and thanking me again for inadvertently sparking changes that had genuinely improved life for every Cedar Hollow homeowner, not just resolving my own personal property dispute but reshaping the entire community's governance for the better. As the small gathering wound down that evening, Renee raised a toast to Walter, acknowledging quietly that none of this recovery, none of this justice, would have been possible without his careful, patient preparation years earlier. Everyone raised their glasses solemnly, honoring a man most of them had never personally met. I thought about how strange this entire journey had been, starting with shock and grief upon discovering 22 illegally constructed buildings on my inherited land,
and ending with a thriving community plaza, genuine friendships, meaningful HOA reforms, and complete legal vindication for everything Walter had quietly anticipated.
Deborah's story served afterward as a genuine cautionary example, referenced occasionally in HOA management seminars and homeowner association training materials across the state, illustrating exactly how unchecked authority, combined with genuine community fear, could enable years of quiet, escalating abuse before anyone finally found courage enough to intervene. Ben eventually wrote a longer feature piece for a regional magazine, examining the entire saga's broader implications for HOA governance nationwide. He interviewed housing policy experts who noted Cedar Hollow's story reflected patterns seen repeatedly across countless similar communities, wherever homeowner oversight remained weak or completely absent. I occasionally gave brief interviews myself, always careful to emphasize that the true story wasn't really about buildings, land, or even Deborah's downfall specifically. It was about the courage required for ordinary people like Harold, George, Tricia, Corey, and Lisa to finally speak up against fear-based, unchecked authority. Thornton Commons celebrated its one-year anniversary with a genuine community festival, food vendors, live music, and children's activities filling the plaza that had once represented such painful, contentious upheaval. Watching families enjoying themselves freely, I felt Walter's quiet satisfaction radiating through every corner of that transformed space. Standing near the fountain during the festival, I reflected on everything that had unfolded since that stunned first afternoon discovering construction crews on my grandfather's field. Grief, shock, fear, determination, courage, and ultimately genuine justice had all woven together into something neither Deborah nor I could have ever predicted. Renee found me there, smiling warmly. Walter would say this was always the plan, she said, gesturing at the thriving plaza around us. I laughed, remembering his handwritten note in that filing cabinet folder. He hadn't planned Thornton Commons specifically, but he'd absolutely planned for someone like Deborah. He always said patience beats panic, I told Renee, watching neighborhood children chase each other happily near the fountain. He prepared quietly for years, trusting I'd eventually need exactly what he'd carefully documented and protected. He was right about everything, every single step of this entire difficult journey. Harold approached with his grandchildren, proudly showing them Thornton Commons for the first time. This place almost became something completely different, he told them solemnly, built on something stolen and hidden. Instead, it became something honest, built on the courage of people who finally refused to stay quiet. I watched Harold's grandchildren wander toward the community garden we'd added near the plaza's edge, laughing freely, completely unaware of everything their grandfather had risked to help expose years of hidden HOA corruption. Some legacies, I realized, mattered most precisely because future generations never had to understand their true cost. As evening settled over the festival, string lights illuminating Thornton Commons for the first time since its grand opening, I found myself standing near Walter's memorial plaque, quietly thanking him again for everything. His patience, his preparation, and his unwavering belief that doing right eventually outlasts doing wrong. George approached quietly, standing beside me near the plaque. "You know," he said, "for years, I thought standing up to Deborah meant losing everything. Turns out, staying silent was actually the thing costing us everything all along." I nodded, understanding completely exactly what he meant by that quiet realization. Tricia joined us moments later, her homemade pie recipe now a regular fixture at Thornton Commons' small bakery stall. "Funny how things work out," she said softly. "The thing meant to divide this community ended up bringing all of us closer together than we've ever genuinely been before." As the festival wound down that night, I walked slowly through the quiet plaza alone, remembering every twist and turn of the past year. Deborah's dismissive smile, Harold's trembling courage, Corey's risky leaked emails, Lisa's years-delayed honesty, George and Tricia's quiet suffering finally acknowledged and properly addressed. Standing near the spot where Walter's old oak tree once stood, now replaced by a small memorial garden, I felt something settle completely within me for the first time since his death. Grief remained, always would, but alongside it now sat genuine peace, hard-won and thoroughly, permanently deserved. I called Priya later that night, thanking her again for everything throughout this exhausting, transformative journey. "You did the hard part," she reminded me gently. "I just organized the paperwork. Walter built the foundation years ago. You simply had the courage to finish exactly what he'd quietly started." 6 months after the anniversary festival, prosecutors announced Deborah's brother-in-law, the recipient of those earlier questionable consulting fees, had also been formally charged following the expanded financial investigation, revealing the corruption ran deeper and wider than even our extensive civil case had initially fully uncovered. This additional charge confirmed something Priya had suspected all along. Deborah's schemes weren't isolated incidents, but rather an interconnected pattern spanning
multiple family members and years of quiet financial abuse, each scheme slightly emboldening the next until the massive commercial plaza fraud finally became inevitable.
The brother-in-law's trial proceeded separately, ultimately resulting in a guilty plea and financial restitution agreement, closing the final chapter on the broader corruption scheme that had quietly enriched Deborah's extended family for years at the direct expense of unsuspecting, trusting Cedar Hollow homeowners throughout that entire period. Alicia's reformed board used the ongoing revelations as continued justification for expanding transparency measures further, implementing mandatory annual third-party audits and public disclosure requirements for any contracts awarded to companies connected, even distantly, to current or former board members serving Cedar Hollow's Homeowners Association. I attended one final HOA meeting roughly a year after everything concluded, invited specifically to discuss Thornton Commons' continued community partnership opportunities. Standing in that same meeting room where Deborah had once dismissively promised to sort out paperwork, I felt the profound weight of everything that had changed. Alicia thanked me publicly for my patience and courage throughout the entire ordeal, acknowledging that Cedar Hollow's governance reforms, though painful and disruptive initially, had ultimately created a far healthier, more transparent, and more genuinely accountable community than anyone had realistically believed possible under Deborah's previous leadership. Several longtime residents approached afterward, thanking me personally for finally exposing years of quiet fear and unchecked authority they'd simply learned to silently tolerate. One elderly woman, previously too afraid to speak publicly, admitted she'd been quietly grateful every single day since Deborah's removal from any real authority. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how differently this entire story could have unfolded had Walter not prepared so carefully years in advance. Or had Harold, Corey, Lisa, George, and Tricia not eventually found genuine courage to speak honestly despite understandable, legitimate fear of serious retaliation. Justice, I realized, rarely arrives through single dramatic moments alone. It builds gradually through patient preparation, quiet courage, and the accumulated weight of many individual truths finally converging together at exactly the right moment, transforming years of unchecked fear into genuine, lasting, meaningful community accountability. Deborah remained in prison, her once formidable reputation now permanently, publicly, and completely destroyed. Her name, once synonymous with unquestioned Cedar Hollow authority, now served instead as a cautionary example whenever homeowners association governance and accountability came up in local community discussions statewide. I visited Walter's grave again that same evening, sitting quietly beside his headstone as the sun began setting gently over Thornton Commons in the near distance. "You were right about everything," I told him softly. "Patience really does beat panic. Preparation really does beat arrogance. You saved us all." Renee joined me there eventually, sitting quietly beside me without speaking for several long minutes. "He'd be proud of you," she finally said. "Not just for winning, but for how you handled everything, with patience, with courage, and without ever losing sight of what actually mattered most throughout it all." I nodded, watching the last golden light fade slowly across the field that had once nearly been stolen entirely, now transformed permanently into something genuinely good for an entire community. Walter's quiet foresight, patient preparation, and unwavering belief in doing right had protected far more than just 12 acres. As twilight settled fully over Cedar Hollow, I felt something like genuine completion for the first time since receiving that devastating phone call months earlier about survey stakes appearing in my grandfather's peaceful, empty field. Justice, though painfully slow, had ultimately, thoroughly, and completely arrived exactly as deserved. In the months that followed, Thornton Commons became something of a local model for community-integrated commercial development, other neighborhoods occasionally visiting, to study how thoughtful design and genuine transparency could transform even the most contentious, painful origins into something lasting, beneficial, and genuinely valued. Harold eventually retired fully from any HOA involvement, spending his newfound free time volunteering at Thornton Commons Community Garden alongside his grandchildren. Finally free from the quiet fear that had shadowed his board involvement for years under Deborah's previously unchecked, increasingly abusive leadership style, Corey completed his business courses eventually, taking on expanded management responsibilities at Thornton Commons, occasionally mentoring other young HOA employees. About recognizing warning signs of unchecked authority abuse before situations could ever escalate as dramatically and painfully as Cedar Hollows once had. Lisa's daughter, inspired by everything she'd witnessed, eventually pursued local government studies in college, citing her mother's delayed but ultimately courageous decision to finally speak up as a formative example of why accountability, even when significantly delayed, always still genuinely mattered enormously. George and Tricia remained close friends of mine, occasionally joining Renee and me for dinner, always reminiscing fondly, sometimes darkly humorously, about the exact year an ambitious HOA president had accidentally handed an entire commercial plaza directly to the very family she tried so hard to quietly steal from. Alicia's reforms held steady over subsequent years, Cedar Hollows Homeowners Association becoming known regionally for genuine transparency and fair, consistent enforcement, a stark, permanent contrast to the fear-based, unchecked authority that had quietly defined the community for over a decade under Deborah's previous, now thoroughly discredited leadership. 2 years after everything concluded, I stood once more at Thornton Commons entrance, watching Walter's name gleam under the afternoon sun. Families moving comfortably through spaces once threatened by greed and unchecked ambition, now permanently secured through patience, courage, and quiet, careful, deliberate preparation. Deborah's eventual release from prison came quietly, without any media attention whatsoever, a stark contrast to her once carefully cultivated public image. She reportedly moved away from Cedar Hollow entirely, starting over somewhere far removed from the community she'd once dominated so completely and so unjustly. I never heard from her again after that single prison visitation years earlier. And honestly, I never needed to. Her downfall had already provided everything necessary: legal vindication, community reform, meaningful friendships forged through shared adversity, and Walter's lasting legacy secured permanently for generations still to come. Renee and I continued running Thornton Commons together, slowly expanding its community offerings, adding a small local history exhibit near the entrance honoring Walter's quiet foresight and the many neighbors whose courage had ultimately transformed a painful theft attempt into something genuinely, lastingly beneficial for everyone. Standing there that final afternoon, watching the community thrive exactly as it should have all along, I understood completely something Walter had always quietly believed. Real justice doesn't arrive through revenge or anger. It arrives through patient preparation, genuine courage, and an unwavering, quiet commitment to what's simply, undeniably right. Looking back across everything that had unfolded, I realized Deborah's greatest miscalculation was never really about property law or falsified documents at all. It was believing that fear could permanently silence an entire community, when all it truly needed was one small crack of courage to finally break completely open. Walter's careful preparation had given me the tools to fight back. But it was Harold, Corey, Lisa, George, and Tricia's collective courage that truly dismantled Deborah's decade of unchecked authority. Justice, in the end, was never a solo victory. It belonged entirely to everyone who finally chose honesty over fear. Thornton Commons stands today exactly where 22 illegally constructed buildings once represented one woman's arrogant, greedy overreach, now instead representing an entire community's hard-won, collective triumph over fear, corruption, and unchecked authority, quietly honoring a patient grandfather who prepared for exactly this moment, years before it ever arrived. And every single time I walk past Walter's name gleaming at the entrance, I remember his quiet promise, fulfilled completely, beyond anything either of us could have ever originally imagined. Some inheritances aren't just land or buildings. Sometimes, they're simply the patient, unshakable courage to finally do what's right.